The morning my daughter-in-law showed up at my back door, I was standing at the kitchen counter sorting through a week's worth of mail I had been ignoring. Bills, flyers, a reminder from my dentist about a cleaning I had already rescheduled twice. It was just past 6 in the morning, and the light through the window over the sink was that particular shade of gray you only get in November in Nova Scotia, the kind that makes everything look like it is waiting for permission to begin. I heard the car before I saw her, the crunch of gravel in the driveway, and then nothing. No engine shutting off, no door opening right away. Just silence. I set down the hydro bill and went to the window. She was still sitting in the driver's seat. Her hands were on the wheel and she was not moving. I went to the door. When she finally stepped out, I could see her face in the porch light, and I had to hold the doorframe with both hands for a moment because the left side of her face was swollen in a way that faces are not supposed to be swollen. Her eye was nearly closed. She was holding her right arm against her body the way you hold something broken, carefully, as if the slightest shift would make it worse. She looked up at me and said, "Mom." Just that. One word. That is what she called me. Not her own mother's word for me. Not anything formal, just Mom. She had started about a year after she married my son, one evening at Thanksgiving when she was helping me carry dishes from the table to the kitchen, and it had come out so naturally that neither of us had remarked on it. I had gone to the sink and run the water so she would not see my eyes. I got her inside. I got her to the kitchen table. I put the kettle on because that is what you do, and because I needed something to do with my hands while my mind caught up to what I was seeing. She would not let me call anyone yet. She wrapped both her hands around the mug I put in front of her and she said, "Please, just let me tell you first." So I sat down and I listened. Her name is Penny. She is 38 years old. She teaches grade 4 at an elementary school about 20 minutes from our house, and she has the kind of voice that is naturally quiet, but that children somehow always hear. She has been married to my son, my youngest, for 5 years. They live in a house on a street with old maple trees that go absolutely ridiculous in October, the kind of street where people still wave from their driveways. They had been trying to have a baby for 3 of those 5 years, and 6 weeks ago, after a lot of disappointment and 2 rounds of something I am still not sure I can pronounce properly, they had finally got news that made my son phone me at 11 o'clock at night just to say, "Mom, it worked." She was 10 weeks along. She told me that the night before, my son had driven to Truro for an overnight work thing, some kind of training session his company had been scheduling for months. She had been home alone. Around 8 in the evening, there had been a knock at the door, and when she answered it, it was my daughter. Her name is Daphne. She is my eldest. She is 54 years old and a chartered professional accountant, and she has lived her entire adult life with a kind of precision that leaves very little room for anything she did not plan for. She had never planned for Penny. From the first Sunday dinner I hosted after my son brought Penny home, Daphne had made her feelings known in the way certain people make feelings known without ever saying them directly. A comment about the food Penny brought, a question about her family background that was shaped like curiosity but had something else underneath it. A way of talking over her at the table that she had never talked over anyone else. I had addressed it more than once. She had always had an explanation that was reasonable enough to make me feel as though I was the one being unreasonable. Penny told me that Daphne had come to the door carrying a bottle of Riesling from a vineyard in the Annapolis Valley and wearing a smile that Penny described as the one she uses at funerals, composed and slightly too wide. She said she wanted to clear the air. She said she had been doing some thinking and she wanted things to be different going forward. Penny, because she is who she is, let her in. They sat in the living room. Daphne opened the wine and poured 2 glasses and pushed one toward Penny, who declined. She said she was taking something for a headache. She had not yet told anyone about the pregnancy except my son. Daphne drank and talked about the family and about how much she felt like things had drifted and how she had always found it difficult to let people in, which she framed as a personal failing she was working on. Penny said she had felt something loosening in her chest. She had spent 5 years hoping for exactly this conversation. Then Daphne set her glass down on the coffee table and her face went somewhere else entirely. She said, "You know he settled for you." She said it the way you might read something off a form. Factually, without heat, she said, I am not being cruel. I am telling you this because someone should have told you years ago. My brother is a kind man, and kind men do things out of obligation that other men would not do. Penny said she did not speak. She was very still. Daphne said, You do not fit here. You never have. And now you are sitting in this house my mother helped them buy, pretending it belongs to you. Penny asked her to leave. What happened after that? She told me slowly and in pieces, her hand pressed flat against the table as if she needed to feel something solid. Daphne did not leave. She stood up, and there was something in how she stood that made Penny back toward the hallway, and Daphne followed her, and there was a moment in the narrow part of the hall between the living room and the front door where Daphne shoved her, hard, against the wall, and then again, and Penny went down. She caught herself partially on the side table in the entryway, the little wooden one we had given them from my late husband's house, and came down hard on her hip and her arm on the tile. She lay there, and Daphne stood over her and said, Whatever you are carrying, it does not belong in this family either. Penny had not said anything to her about the pregnancy. She did not know how Daphne knew, but somehow she knew. Daphne left. She pulled the front door shut quietly, the way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping, and she was gone. Penny had lain on the floor for a long time. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. She was trying to understand whether the pain in her side was serious or whether she was catastrophizing, the way she sometimes does, the way she tells me she has always done. She was afraid to call my son because she knew what he would do, and she did not want the worst night of her life to also be the night their family cracked open before they had even had a chance to be one. So she had gotten herself up and gotten herself into her car and driven 40 minutes in the dark to my house. 40 minutes, with something wrong in her hip and her arm and her face looking like that. I called an ambulance. I did not ask her this time. I rode with her, and I sat in the waiting area at the hospital, and I fought with the particular clarity that comes to me when I am frightened and there is nothing to do but sit. I am not a woman who makes decisions from panic. My husband used to say that I was the calmest person he had ever met in a crisis, and the most emotional one he had ever met everywhere else. He was not wrong. Penny had a hairline fracture in her wrist, a deep contusion along her hip. The eye socket was bruised but intact. And the baby, the small, impossible fact of the baby, was fine. The doctor used the word robust. I held that word in my head like something I needed to carry carefully. I went back to the waiting area, and I did not call Daphne. I called my brother. His name is Walter. He is 70 years old, and he spent 26 years as a Crown attorney in Halifax before his knees forced him into retirement, which he has filled with woodworking and very long opinions about everything. He is the most methodical person I have ever known. Our father, who raised the two of us on his own after our mother passed when I was 11, used to say that Walter had been born already thinking things through. He once spent 6 months researching which lawnmower to buy. He returned it after 4 days because he had found a flaw in his research process and needed to start over. I told him what had happened. I told him plainly and in order, the way he taught me to do when we were young. Just the facts, Vera. Everything else can wait. When I finished, there was a silence. Then he said, "Where is Daphne now?" I said I assumed she was at home. He said, "Do not call her. Do not tell her what Penny told you. Tell your son in the morning, not tonight. There is nothing he can do tonight that will help, and there is plenty he could do that would make things significantly worse. Let me make some calls." I said, "Walter, what are you going to do?" He said, "What Dad taught us." I knew exactly what he meant. Our father had been a quiet man in the way that rivers are quiet, all the movement happening somewhere you cannot see. He had once spent 2 years documenting a dispute with the municipality over a property assessment, and at the end of those 2 years, he had walked into the appeals office in Dartmouth with a binder 3 inches thick and walked out with a full correction and a formal apology letter. He never raised his voice once. He simply showed people what he knew. My son arrived at the hospital at 6:45 in the morning. He had gotten my message. He walked through those doors, and he did not stop at the desk or look at me. He just went straight down the hall and I let him go because that was the right thing to do. I sat in that chair and I drank the worst coffee I have had in recent memory, and I waited. He came back out after about 25 minutes and sat down beside me. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything, Mom, all of it." I told him. He was quiet for a long time after. A specific kind of quiet, the kind I recognized from when he was a boy and trying very hard not to do the wrong thing. Then he said, "I am going to her house right now." I said, "No." He looked at me. I said, "You are going to stay with your wife. Walter is handling this. You trust me." He looked at me for another moment and then he nodded, slowly, because in his entire life his mother and his uncle Walter had never once steered him wrong, and whatever was left of his rational mind understood that. What I did not yet know was what Walter had already found. He called me at 7:30 the next morning. I was still at the hospital, in the chair that had more or less become mine, eating a granola bar from the vending machine because I had forgotten to eat anything, and my hands were beginning to shake slightly in that way they do when my blood sugar drops. Walter had not slept. He had spent the night on the phone. He had called 4 people he had known through his years with the Crown, a retired RCMP investigator, a woman now practicing family law in Dartmouth, a colleague who had moved into civil litigation, and a man he had articled with 40 years ago who now did something in forensic accounting that Walter had never needed to understand until the night before. He had asked them all a version of the same question. If a person entered another person's home and committed a physical assault against a pregnant woman that resulted in documented injuries, and if that person had made a statement indicating foreknowledge of the pregnancy, what were the available options under Nova Scotia law? He had also, and this is the part I had not expected, called a woman named Patricia who lived 2 houses down from my son and Penny on that street with the maple trees. Walter had known her late husband through the Rotary Club. He had not spoken to her in several years. He called her at 7 in the morning and she answered because she is the kind of woman who is already awake at 7, and Walter explained the situation in the careful, unalarming way he explains everything, and Patricia said, "Well, Walter, you should know I have a security camera on my front porch that covers most of the street because there had been some car break-ins last spring. Daphne's car was on that footage. Arrival time, departure time, and, Patricia said, a period of about 8 minutes where the car sat at the curve after Daphne got back into it before it finally pulled away. 8 minutes. Sitting in the car in front of her brother's house after what she had done. Walter said, "Thera, there is more." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I asked your son some questions this morning about the last 5 years. About specific things, specific dates, things Daphne said or did. He was reluctant at first. You know how he is? He does not like to speak against family. But when I asked him specific questions with specific dates, he answered them. And when you lay those answers out in order, it does not look like a difficult personality. It looks like a pattern. It looks like something that was always moving in one direction." He told me about comments Daphne had made about Penny's background, about her teaching salary, about whether a grade school teacher was a sensible match for a man in my son's position. He told me about a family event 2 years ago, a birthday dinner for my son, where Daphne had said something to Penny in the kitchen, quietly, that Penny had never repeated to him, but that had changed the whole temperature of the evening. He told me about a time Daphne had spoken to my son's manager at a company Christmas party in a way that had seemed like ordinary conversation until a week later, when my son's manager had made an offhand comment that had clearly been seeded by something Daphne said. 5 years of it, each piece small enough to dismiss. Together it was something else entirely. Walter said, "Vera, when someone hurts the people you love, you have 2 choices. You respond from how you feel, or you respond from what you know. How you feel is useful information. What you know is what actually changes things." I said, "Walter, tell me what you need from me." He needed me to sit with Penny, gently and without pressure, and ask her whether she would be willing to speak to the police. He needed her to understand that she had complete control over that decision and that whatever she chose, my son and I and Walter would support her without condition. He also wanted me to understand that regardless of what Penny decided, there were options available that did not require her to do anything at all. Penny filed the report. She did it 2 days after she came home from the hospital, sitting at my kitchen table with my son beside her, and a mug of tea she kept warming her hands on, even though she was not drinking it. The officer was a young woman who sat across from her and took notes and asked questions in a tone that was matter-of-fact and steady, and treated Penny like a person who had a clear account of something that had happened to her, which she did. Daphne was contacted by the Halifax Regional Police 11 days later. I was not there for that conversation. I did not need to be. What I learned afterward, through my son who heard it from the investigator Walter had connected us with, was that Daphne had been genuinely surprised. Not surprised in the way of someone who did not expect consequences, but surprised in a more specific way, surprised that anyone had documented anything. She had operated for a long time apparently on the understanding that what happened inside family stayed inside family, that it would be processed and absorbed and eventually filed away like everything else had been. She had underestimated Patricia's security camera. She had underestimated Walter's 40 years of professional contacts, and she had significantly underestimated Penny, who had driven 40 minutes in the dark because she trusted that when she got here, the door would open. Daphne retained a lawyer. Her lawyer sent a letter. Walter's contact in civil litigation sent one back that was, by all accounts I received secondhand, considerably more detailed. I will not walk through every step of the months that followed because a lot of it belonged to my son and Penny, and not to me to carry publicly. What I will tell you is the part that Walter told me 3 months in, on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with the kind of expression he gets when he has been thinking about something for a long time and has finally decided to say it. He said, "Vera, did you know that Daphne has been managing the books for a small property management company for the past 6 years?" I said yes, I knew that. She had done it as a side arrangement for the owner who was an old acquaintance of her former firm. He said, "And did you know that the owner has been trying for 2 years to understand why his quarterly numbers have not been adding up?" I looked at him. Walter said, "I noticed something in a conversation with my forensic accounting contact back in November." I want to be precise with you. I did not pursue this on your behalf, and I did not use any information that was not in the legitimate possession of the people I spoke with. But when I asked my contact a general question about the kinds of financial arrangements that tend to accompany a certain kind of controlling behavior in family situations, he mentioned a pattern, and that pattern was familiar to me in a way I could not ignore. He had made one phone call to the property owner. He had not made accusations. He had simply asked a question and suggested that the man speak to a forensic accountant of his own. The property owner had already suspected. He had simply not known where to begin. Walter said, "I had known something was off for about 18 months. I had no evidence and no standing to act on it. I waited until there was a thread to pull. I said, 'And now?' He said, 'And now someone else is pulling it. And that is not my doing, Vera. That is the natural consequence of things being brought into the light.'" Daphne's arrangement with the property company came apart over the following weeks. The amounts involved were not enormous by any external standard, but they were significant, and more to the point, they were documented. She was removed from the arrangement. There was a civil claim. The professional consequences were the kind that tend to follow a CPA through their career in ways that are very difficult to reverse. The criminal matter, the assault, moved through the process at its own pace, which is to say, slowly but steadily. There was a diversion route available to her given no prior record, but it involved conditions, mandatory counseling, a period of supervision, a formal acknowledgement that was part of the record. Her lawyer negotiated. Walter's contact watched the process. Penny was kept informed at every stage, and nothing moved without her knowing. My son and Daphne have not spoken in 7 months. I have spoken to Daphne once. It was a brief conversation, and I said what I needed to say, and I did not say it with anger, because anger was not what the moment required. I said, "You hurt someone who trusted you, in a home that is theirs, and whatever you told yourself to make that acceptable is something you need to work out with someone who is not me." She hung up. I went back to what I had been doing. My granddaughter was born on a Wednesday in March. She weighed 6 pounds 14 ounces, and she came into the world in the particular, focused, determined way that I suspect she will approach most things. My son called me from the delivery room, and when I heard her in the background, I sat down on the stairs in my front hall, and I pressed my hand over my mouth, and I let myself have a moment. I drove to the hospital. I sat in a chair in the hallway outside the room, and I waited because they needed their time, the three of them. After a while, my son came out and said, "Mom, come in." Penny was sitting up in the bed with a small person in her arms, and she looked exhausted in a way that was also, I don't know how else to say this, radiant. In the way that people are radiant when they have come through something enormous and arrived somewhere they were not sure they would get to. She looked up at me and said, "Mom, do you want to hold her?" I held her. I stood by the window and I held my granddaughter, and I thought about my father and his binders full of careful documentation, and I thought about Walter making phone calls at midnight in the particular calm of someone who has spent a lifetime believing that patience, properly applied, does not need to announce itself. Her name is Briar. She is 3 months old now. She has her father's forehead and her mother's calm attention. When you talk to her, she watches your face with the focused seriousness of someone who is taking notes. I go to their house every Sunday. I bring butter tarts from the bakery in town because that is my contribution, and it has been since before she and my son were married. Penny meets me at the door. We drink tea, and the baby sits in her bouncer chair in the living room in the afternoon light, which at this time of year in Nova Scotia comes through the window at a low angle and turns everything it touches the color of old honey. And I think, every single time, about what it costs to get to a moment like this. It costs more than it should. That is the truth. You do things the long way because the short way would have broken something that matters more. You hold your tongue when everything in you wants to speak. You wait when waiting is the hardest thing. And then, one Sunday, you are sitting in a living room that smells like butter tarts and baby shampoo, and your son is laughing at something on the other side of the kitchen, and your daughter-in-law is telling you something about a parent at her school, and your granddaughter is looking at the light on the wall with total absorption, and the cost doesn't disappear, but it becomes the right price for the right thing. I am 62 years old. I have made mistakes in my life, and I have had people make mistakes at my expense. And the thing I know now that I did not know when I was younger is that there is a difference between letting things go and letting things be handled. You do not have to carry everything yourself. You do not have to be the loudest voice in the room. You do not have to respond in kind. What you need is one person who thinks before they act. What you need is the willingness to let the truth do what the truth does when you stop trying to rush it. And you need to know with absolute certainty that the people who showed up at your door in the dark did so because they believed somewhere underneath everything that you would open it. That belief is the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me. I do not intend to be the kind of person who makes them regret it. I have thought about that November morning many times since. Not obsessively, not with the kind of replaying that keeps you up at night, but with the slow, returning attention you give to something you are still figuring out. Penny drove 40 minutes in the dark with a fractured wrist and a bruised hip and a baby she was terrified for, and she came to my house. Not to the hospital, not to a friend's. To my kitchen, with the gray light coming through the window and the Hydro bill sitting on the counter. That fact tells me everything I need to know about what I had been building for 5 years without realizing I was building anything at all. The thing about Daphne is that she was not wrong to think her behavior would be absorbed. It had been absorbed. For years I had smoothed things over and told myself it was a difficult personality, a complicated history, the kind of friction that exists in families and does not mean anything larger. I had made excuses because making excuses was easier than facing what the pattern actually looked like when you laid it out in order. Walter laid it out in order for me, and I could not unsee it after that. There is a kind of harm that depends entirely on nobody looking at it directly. It operates in the gaps, in the things said quietly in kitchens, in the comments that are plausibly just bluntness, in the cumulative weight of 100 small dismissals that each one individually could be explained away. What Daphne did the night she went to that house had been building for 5 years. She had simply run out of room to keep it contained. What I understand now is that patience is not the same as passivity. My father knew that. Walter knows it. I think I knew it too, somewhere underneath everything, but I had confused the two for a long time. Patience means you wait until you understand what you are actually dealing with. Passivity means you wait because you do not want to deal with it at all. I had been passive for years, telling myself I was being patient. The difference cost Penny a fractured wrist and 40 minutes alone in the dark. That is the part I sit with. Not Daphne's consequences, which were real and appropriate and arrived through legitimate channels without any need for noise or drama, but my own earlier choice to keep the peace rather than look at what was disturbing it. The peace I kept was not peace. It was just deferred difficulty with interest accumulating. What I know now at 62 that I did not know at 40 is that integrity is not a single dramatic decision. It is not one moment where you stand up and say the right thing. It is the accumulation of smaller decisions made long before the crisis, decisions about what you are willing to see clearly, about what you are willing to name, about what you will not pretend is acceptable because pretending is more comfortable. Briar is 3 months old and she will grow up in a house where she is entirely wanted and where the people around her chose, under pressure and at cost, to tell the truth rather than keep things smooth. That is the inheritance I want to give her, not a clean family history, just people who, when it mattered, did not look away.